Prison was never supposed to scare Frank Lucas. By the time the gates closed behind him, he had already survived Harlem, Vietnam routes, and men who smiled while planning your death. Still, prison had its own gravity, its own rules that existed beneath the written ones. Frank understood that immediately. He moved with calm, spoke only when necessary, and observed everything. Before we go any deeper into what happened next, let me say something quietly, the way real power usually moves. We have a dream of reaching 1,000 subscribers by the end of this month. If you appreciate untold stories inspired by real figures in real eras, subscribe, leave your like, and be part of this dream. Because what unfolded inside those walls was never meant for records. It was meant to be remembered. The attack didn't come from a rival with a name or a reputation. It came from a man who believed prison flattened all hierarchies, that iron bars erase history. The first shove was sudden, meant to provoke, to test. Words followed, sharp, disrespectful, designed to humiliate in front of others. Frank absorbed it without flinching. When the man struck again, louder this time, the block reacted not with chaos but with attention. Every inmate knew this moment mattered. Frank turned, looked at the man fully for the first time, and smiled. Not mockingly, not cruelly. It was the kind of smile that signaled comprehension, the kind that told everyone watching that the situation had already ended, even if no one else knew how yet. Frank did not raise his hands. He did not threaten. He did not call out for help. He simply stepped back into his space, reclaiming it with posture alone. That restraint confused the attacker. Confusion in prison is dangerous. Older inmates exchanged brief looks. Some stopped pacing. Others sat down. The guards, unaware of the significance, continued their routines. What they couldn't see was a recalibration happening beneath the surface. The attack had crossed an invisible line, not just against Frank Lucas, but against the unspoken order that kept the block stable. Minutes passed. The attacker laughed, mistaking silence for victory. But the laughter didn't spread. It died where it landed. The prison had begun to correct itself. Frank remained still, his smile gone now, replaced by neutrality. He didn't need to move. He didn't need to speak. The system inside the walls had already decided something important. Violence without understanding invites consequence without warning. And as the air grew heavy with expectation, everyone present sensed the same truth. The attack was over, but the response had only just begun. The prison did not explode after the attack. It narrowed. Conversations thinned to murmurs, then to looks. The block's usual noise, metal clatter, idle jokes, the restless pacing, slowed into something deliberate. Men who had been circling each other for reasons of their own suddenly recalculated distance. In places like this, distance is language. Frank Lucas felt it without turning his head. The space around him reorganized, not out of fear, but out of recognition. The attack had created a question, and the room was deciding how it would be answered. Frank returned to his routine as if the moment had never occurred. He washed his hands, sat where he had planned to sit, spoke to no one. That calm did more than any threat could have. It told the block that escalation was unnecessary. It told the older inmates, men who understood survival beyond strength, that whatever came next would not be loud or rushed. They watched the attacker instead. Attention shifted, clean and precise, like a spotlight moving without a hand on the switch. The man who had struck Frank felt it before he understood it. His confidence softened into irritation, then into something closer to doubt. He tried to reclaim the moment with words, testing the room for laughter that didn't arrive. He took a step, then another, as if movement alone could reassert control. But movement only revealed how alone he had become. In prison, isolation happens before punishment. It is the warning that no one will intervene. The attacker glanced toward Frank, expecting reaction, anger, challenge, anything. He received nothing. Frank did not look back. That absence was the answer. The room had absorbed the insult, measured it, and found it incompatible with its balance. Minutes stretched, and with them came alignment. Men adjusted where they stood. Someone sat. Someone else stood closer to the rail. No signals were exchanged, no instructions passed. Order, once disrupted, was restoring itself the way it always does, through consensus. Frank Lucas did not own that consensus. He embodied it. By the time the guards made their pass, the moment had already been sealed. The attack had failed to provoke a fight, but it had succeeded in exposing a mistake. And mistakes, in places governed by memory, are never forgotten, only answered at a time the room chooses. The attacker began to understand that the room was no longer neutral. Neutrality in prison is safety. Once it dissolves, time becomes an adversary. He paced, trying to burn off the unease, but every step seemed to make the air heavier. Men who had nothing to do with the incident adjusted their positions with purpose, not to threaten, but to clarify lanes. The geometry of the block changed, angles narrowing, sight lines closing. Frank Lucas remained where he was, steady and unreadable, allowing the environment to do what it had already decided to do. In that stillness, the attacker felt the first real consequence, not pain, but inevitability. Older inmates recognized the pattern instantly. This was how order reasserted itself when rules had been ignored and pride had done the rest. No rush, no spectacle, just a slow tightening that made escape feel impractical. The attacker tried to speak to someone he knew, a familiar face from earlier days, but the reply never came. Not a refusal, worse. A pause, a glance away, a conversation that resumed without him. In prison, abandonment is not loud. It is procedural. Frank did not witness these moments directly, and that was the point. Authority that needs to watch its own enforcement is already weak. The guards passed through again, indifferent to the currents beneath their boots. They saw bodies, not alignments, noise levels, not meaning. As they moved on, the room returned to motion, but with a new choreography. The attacker drifted toward a corner he believed was safer, guided there by his own fear more than by anyone else. Fear is an efficient guide when options are few. Frank Lucas shifted his weight once, a small movement that meant nothing to a casual eye and everything to those who knew how rooms read men. Minutes later, the correction arrived without announcement, not as an ambush, not as a brawl, but as a brief, decisive interruption that ended as quickly as it began. No shouting followed, no celebration. The block resumed its rhythm with a steadiness that told everyone the account had been settled. Frank did not react. He did not look toward the disturbance or away from it. He remained composed, as if nothing had happened, because for him, the important part had already passed. The attack had been answered by time itself, and time, once it chooses a side, does not argue. What unsettled the block most was not what had happened, but how quickly it disappeared into quiet. The disturbance did not echo. It did not invite questions. It ended, and the air sealed over it as if trained to do so. Men returned to their places with the discipline of people who had seen this kind of correction before and knew better than to inspect it. In prison, silence after impact is not denial. It is confirmation. The room had accepted the outcome, and acceptance is the final step in restoring order. Frank Lucas felt the shift settle, without looking up. He had lived long enough to recognize when a situation had completed itself. There was no satisfaction in it, no relief. Only a calm recognition that balance had been recovered at the lowest possible cost of the whole. He continued his routine, slow, deliberate movements that communicated permanence. Those watching him did not mistake that composure for indifference. They understood it as stewardship. Frank had not taken something from the room. He had given it back its equilibrium. The attacker, now altered in a way that could not be undone, moved differently when he returned. Not weaker, changed. He spoke less. He chose edges. He learned routes that avoided attention. No one mocked him, and no one offered comfort. Compassion would have confused the lesson. Cruelty would have cheapened it. The room did neither. It simply moved on, letting the consequence stand on its own. In places governed by memory, outcomes teach better than stories ever could. Guards noticed the calm before they noticed anything else. Counts went smoother. Arguments that usually flared died early. Paperwork told them nothing, and so they assumed luck or compliance. They could not see the agreement that had formed beneath the routines. They could not see how the block had selected stability and closed ranks around it. Frank Lucas had not demanded that stability. He had modeled it, and once modeled clearly enough, stability tends to defend itself. By the next count, the prison had already archived the incident in the only place that mattered: behavior. Men adjusted how they spoke, how they joked, how they tested space. It wasn't fear that guided them, it was efficiency. The block had discovered that unnecessary conflict carried a cost, and that cost arrived quietly and stayed. Frank Lucas became a reference point without becoming a spectacle. People didn't look to him for approval. They looked to the order that seemed to organize itself around his presence. In environments like this, the difference is everything. The man who had attacked him existed now as a lesson rather than a problem. He wasn't targeted, harassed, or singled out again. He was simply no longer central to anything. He moved through the block with care, eyes scanning routes instead of faces, learning how to pass time without inviting attention. No one spoke about what had happened, because speaking would have weakened it. The outcome stood on its own. The prison prefers outcomes that don't need narration. Frank maintained the same cadence he had always kept: measured steps, deliberate pauses, a voice used sparingly. He didn't expand influence or collect favors. That restraint mattered. Power that grows after correction invites another test. Power that stays exactly where it was signals finality. Older inmates recognized this immediately. They had seen men lose control by pressing advantage. Frank did not. He let the room keep what it had decided, and that decision settled into routine. Administrators would later note a stretch of unusual calm on the block, attributing it to scheduling or luck. They never connected it to the moment when a line had been crossed and then redrawn without ceremony. Inside, the truth was simpler. The attack had clarified a rule everyone already half knew. Respect isn't enforced by noise. It's enforced by alignment. And alignment, once achieved, doesn't ask permission to continue. The days that followed confirmed what the room had already accepted. There were no echoes of the incident, no aftershocks that demanded attention. Instead, the block settled into a steadier pace, as if a loose bolt had finally been tightened. Men who once tested limits recalculated what limits were worth testing. The unspoken agreement held because it benefited everyone. Stability meant fewer surprises, fewer interruptions, fewer moments where a misunderstanding could spiral into something permanent. Frank Lucas did not become louder or more visible in that calm. He became constant, and constancy carries its own authority. Those who knew prison best understood why no one challenged him again. It wasn't because of the outcome alone. It was because of the timing. The delay between the attack and the correction had taught the room something essential. Reaction wasn't impulsive here. It was considered. That knowledge discouraged bravado more effectively than threats ever could. Men learned to weigh not just what they did, but when they did it, and whether the room would agree with them afterward. In a place governed by shared consequences, agreement is the only shield that matters. Frank continued to move through the block with the same economy, the same measured attention to details others overlooked. He listened more than he spoke. When he did speak, it was about ordinary things: food, schedules, weather, never about what happened. That omission was intentional. Naming a moment freezes it in time. Leaving it unnamed allows it to become structure. The structure, now in place, reduced friction on its own. New arrivals sensed it quickly. They weren't warned. They observed. Observation did the rest. The attacker, living on the margins of the new order, became proof without becoming spectacle. He followed routines carefully and avoided attention not out of terror, but out of understanding. The room did not punish him further. It didn't need to. The lesson had completed itself, and completion is the cleanest end. Frank Lucas had not needed to assert dominance. He had allowed the block to choose balance, and then step aside while it protected that choice. And once a prison chooses balance, it guards it fiercely, because balance, unlike fear, makes time survivable. As weeks passed, the block began to wear its calm the way a city wears rebuilt streets. Quietly, gratefully, without ceremony. Small tensions that once flared dissolved before they could harden. Men corrected themselves mid-sentence. Jokes softened into observation. Disagreements ended earlier, resolved by a glance or a pause rather than a push. The room had learned what kind of friction it could afford, and what kind it could not. Frank Lucas did not patrol this order. He inhabited it. His presence became a fixed coordinate. something others measured themselves against without needing to look. Older inmates noticed how the correction had changed incentives. There was no advantage in testing boundaries that responded with patience instead of rage. Impatience had lost its payoff. The block rewarded those who kept time well, who understood when to move and when to let a moment pass. That lesson spread faster than any rumor, because it made life easier. In prison, anything that reduces uncertainty is adopted quickly. The room didn't need a leader issuing instructions. It needed a standard that proved reliable. Frank's restraint had done exactly that. The guards, rotating through their shifts, sensed the difference without grasping its source. They recorded fewer incidents, fewer write-ups, fewer nights where voices rose for no clear reason. The block felt predictable, almost cooperative, which made it uninteresting to scrutinize. Uninteresting spaces are the safest ones. The order held not because it was enforced, but because it removed reasons to break it. Frank understood this better than anyone. He had always known that the strongest systems are the ones people choose because they work. When newcomers arrived, they adapted quickly. No one pulled them aside to warn them about Frank Lucas. They learned the way everyone learns in places like this, by watching where people stood, how long silences lasted, which names were spoken carefully and which weren't spoken at all. Within days, the rhythm took them in. That was the final confirmation that the order would last. It no longer depended on memory of an incident. It depended on habit. And habits, once set, defend themselves. By the time seasons shifted and faces changed, the incident no longer lived as an event. It lived as a standard. Men didn't remember dates or details. They remember how the room felt afterward, lighter, steadier, less inclined to test itself. Frank Lucas had not imposed that feeling. He had revealed it. In places where survival depends on reading the room correctly, revelation is more powerful than instruction. The block kept what worked and discarded what didn't, and what worked was restraint backed by inevitability. Frank never referenced the attack, not even indirectly. He understood that power loses precision when it rehearses itself. The smile, once given, needed no sequel. He continued to move with the same economy, the same attention to ordinary things. That ordinariness was the point. Men who rely on spectacle must repeat it. Men who rely on alignment do not. The prison aligned around the idea that respect was not negotiable and consequences did not need to be advertised. Once that idea took root, it governed without supervision. Outside the walls, stories about Frank Lucas grew noisier and less accurate, shaped by distance and imagination. Inside, the truth remained exact and quiet. The block didn't celebrate the outcome. It benefited from it. Time passed more predictably. Conflicts resolved earlier. The days, while still heavy, became manageable. That manageability was the real legacy of the moment. Not fear, not dominance. Predictability. In prison, predictability is mercy. When the chapter finally closed, through transfers, releases, and the slow erosion of memory, the rule remained intact. New men arrived and learned without being told. They learned by watching pauses, by noticing where laughter stopped, by feeling how quickly the room corrected unnecessary heat. That was the final proof. Frank Lucas had not needed to threaten, posture, or demand allegiance. A smile had been enough to restore balance. And balance, once restored and chosen by everyone, becomes law.